Hey, from Indiana Jones to He-Man, everybody seems to be fighting snakes. And why not? They represent the reptilian brain and an innate fear that humanity can have, and making them into enemies for the He-Man line made sense in 1986, 1987, and their legacy lives on today with modern versions of a lot of these figures, including getting to all the major Snakemen figures in Masters of the Universe Classics. And today we're looking at another one of those, Tung Lashor. So let's jump in. Tung Lashor was part of the original assortment of Snakemen. They had a second wave that came a year later, which included Snakeface. They all tied into an origin story told in the mini-comics where King Hiss had been a dimensional conquering tyrant, was trapped under Snake Mountain, and then released. And along with him came his flunkies, because, all bad guys have flunkies. Tung Lashor is interesting because he's one of the characters that changed a lot from his early concept. Much like all of the Snakemen, different revisions were made. Snakeface went from being more of kind of an armored character to organic and kind of Medusa-like, and Tung Lashor went from being more of a, well, I guess kind of hoppy, toad-like character to something that in the end resembled more of a salamander, and is probably the least snake of all the Snakemen. His main feature, of course, being his tongue, hence Tung Lashor, and all of the Snakemen tended to be defined by one reptilian aspect, if you will, where King Hiss had, breakaway skin, Rattler had the tail, and Snakeface had the Medusa stare, Squeeze had giant snake arms, Tung Lashor, and others, just like Fangor, who is a character I helped co-create, whose focus was the teeth, the fang aspect of snakes. Same goes for, that was essentially the DNA or the blueprint for all the Snakeman characters. Take one reptilian aspect and, go all in. And Tung Lashor was all in about the tongue. And that was kind of the problem, because his action feature was very hard to develop and wasn't working properly for the longest time. It's controlled with a rotating gear mechanism that sticks out of his back, which allows the tongue to go in and out, but originally it was just meant to be a pull, and then would retract kind of like a tape measure. Unfortunately, this wasn't working, and the figure had to go through quite a few redesigns. And there was also a major cost reduction in the vintage figure, where the first release had his back fully painted with all of the purple detail, and later releases removed this deco as part of a cost reduction, probably to make the line more affordable, and honestly, back then, kids really weren't that focused on whether or not the back of a figure was painted. Tung Lashor is also significant because in addition to coming with the standard Snakeman staff, comes with a really cool dragonfly crossbow, which is kind of ties into his Horde alliance, which we'll get into in a moment too. But yeah, with the Snakemen usually always coming with the same accessories, it's cool to get something different. Looking at his Filmation appearance, and I mentioned his Horde connection, that's where a lot of it came from. The Snakemen were developed while the Princess of Power show was being developed and were sort of absconded into it as members of the Horde, even though the Masters of the Universe action figure releases had them as an independent faction of the Snakemen. Tung Lashor also looked a lot more like his early prototype concept, where he's a bit more frog-like, I guess, if you will. Maybe a little bit more snake-like, whether or not he, has his jetpack on or not. He doesn't really look a lot like the toy counterpart. Rattler, maybe a little bit more so, but again, that's because the design for the animated version was based on his early prototype concept. This was explained away in the mini-comics that several of the Snakemen were allied with Hordak, simply waiting for King Hiss to return. This was also then incorporated into several of his figure releases, and in the Filmation style look, he would be given a Horde armband. Explained away in the 2000X series that what was happening was Cobra Khan was convincing King Hiss that all of his other flunkies were betraying him, which is why the continuity for Classics, which follows that, had Tung Lashor becoming a member of the Horde with the removable armband there included on the figure. So it was cool. You could now make him a member of the Snakemen or a member of the Horde, whichever continuity you wanted to follow, the original mini-comics, or the 2000X series, which then directly tied and was the sort of impetus behind the bios, all based on the produced and unproduced 2000X scripts. Unlike the vintage toy, Tung Lashor didn't have an action feature, but we were able to recreate that, as with many, with an alternate head. So you had one head with the tongue, one head without. I don't think there was any debate about this at all. He was always flagged as a double-headed figure, if you will, that was going to need a second head. Now, the vintage action feature, which had a dial similar to Cyclone here. Cyclone's original figure, the dial on the belt, is what caused his arms to go out and spin around. We paid homage to this on the Classics figure by having this as a belt detail, the gear that was once used to start up the action feature on the vintage toy. This didn't really work so well with Tung Lashor because the gear sticks out of his back, so it looks a little bit more organic versus being able to include it as a tech detail on a belt like with Cyclone. So he never got the that detail added to his back. And he wasn't bigger like he was in 2000X. I mean, you could get the Staction figures, but again, with Classics, we were going for updating the vintage figures, not creating the scale difference that was stylistic to the 2000X line. And for a character that's much more of a salamander than a snake, he still is a very beloved Snake Man. And, I think it's because of his colors and his action feature. We had almost unlimited supply of Snake Men, as the people working on the line just kept creating more and more Snake Man characters. Because honestly, they're really popular, and in the vintage line, we were only limited by the 5 figures released. It was cool that as new creators were coming along, one of the things people seemed to be very passionate about was adding to the Snake Man ranks. So hey, maybe we'll still see even more Snake Man figures created in the future. But as a figure that was a vintage Snake Man, Tung Lashor is absolutely a fan favorite. Whether it was his unique accessory, his bright colors, his non-snaky salamandery look, I'm really I'm really proud, I can speak today, that we got to all of the core Snake Men in Classics. And with fans of Tung Lashor, the Classics figure really does a great job of updating this. I had no qualms about it. I think he came out perfect. And maybe there'll be Tung Lashor to come.